In the summer of 1914, Europe stood at the pinnacle of its power and confidence. The great empires that dominated the continent had never seemed stronger or more secure. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's land and population, its navy ruling the seas without challenge. The German Empire was the industrial powerhouse of Europe, its factories producing steel and chemicals at rates that astonished the world. The Austro-Hungarian Empire stretched across Central Europe, a patchwork of different peoples held together by the ancient Habsburg dynasty. The Russian Empire sprawled across 2 continents, its massive armies and vast population seemingly guaranteeing its position as a great power. The Ottoman Empire, though aging and weakened, still controlled much of the Middle East and southeastern Europe, and France, humiliated by Prussia in 1870 but now recovered, sought to reclaim its position as the leading power on the continent. This world of empires was built on assumptions that seemed unshakable. Progress appeared inevitable. Technology was advancing at an unprecedented rate. Railways and telegraphs connected distant cities. Ocean liners crossed the Atlantic in days rather than weeks. The internal combustion engine was beginning to replace the horse. Flight had been achieved just 11 years earlier. Medicine was conquering diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia. The standard of living for ordinary people was rising. Literacy was spreading. Democratic reforms were expanding the franchise even in autocratic empires. Trade connected the economies of the world in ways that made war seem economically irrational. The British economist Norman Angell had published a book in 1910 titled The Great Illusion, arguing that war between major powers was now impossible because it would be economically catastrophic for victors and vanquished alike. Many believed him, but beneath this surface of confidence and progress, tensions were building that would tear this world apart. The very system of alliances that was supposed to keep the peace was actually creating the conditions for catastrophic war. In 1879, Germany and Austria-Hungary formed an alliance. In 1894, France and Russia allied, creating a potential two-front threat to Germany. In 1904, Britain and France set aside their colonial rivalries and formed the Entente Cordiale. In 1907, Britain and Russia resolved their differences and formed an agreement. These alliances created 2 armed camps in Europe. On one side stood the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other stood the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. Any conflict between members of these rival blocs risked drawing in all the great powers. The arms race that accompanied these alliances was unprecedented. Military spending soared. Germany expanded its navy, directly challenging British naval supremacy. Britain responded by building dreadnought battleships that made all previous warships obsolete, then building more dreadnoughts when Germany built its own. Armies expanded in size and capability. New weapons proliferated. Machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Artillery pieces could hurl high-explosive shells miles with devastating accuracy. Military leaders developed elaborate war plans. Germany's Schlieffen Plan called for a rapid offensive through Belgium to defeat France before turning east to face Russia. France's Plan 17 called for an immediate offensive to reclaim the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. Russia planned massive offensives against both Germany and Austria-Hungary. These war plans were rigid and based on railway timetables. Once mobilization began, it would be nearly impossible to stop. Nationalism was perhaps the most dangerous force destabilizing the pre-war order. In the multi-ethnic empires of Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottomans, nationalist movements threatened to tear these states apart. The South Slavs in Austria-Hungary looked to Serbia as a potential liberator. Poles dreamed of independence from the empires that had partitioned their country. Czechs sought autonomy or independence from Habsburg rule. Armenians in the Ottoman Empire faced increasing persecution. Irish nationalists challenged British rule, but nationalism was not just a force for liberation. It was also an aggressive ideology that glorified the nation above all else, that saw international relations as a struggle for dominance, that celebrated military values and was willing to embrace war as a test of national vitality. In every country, nationalist movements pushed for more aggressive foreign policies and larger military budgets. The Balkans was the powder keg that everyone knew could explode into general war. The Ottoman Empire had been retreating from the region for decades, leaving behind a vacuum filled by competing nationalisms and great power rivalries. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 had redrawn the map and created new tensions. Serbia had emerged from these wars enlarged and emboldened, seeing itself as the Piedmont of the South Slavs, the nucleus around which a greater South Slav state could form. This terrified Austria-Hungary, which ruled over millions of South Slavs. If they were inspired by Serbian nationalism to seek independence or union with Serbia, the empire could disintegrate. Russian support for Serbia as a fellow Slavic nation meant that any conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia risked Russian intervention, and German support for Austria-Hungary meant that Russian intervention could bring Germany into the war. And French alliance with Russia meant that German intervention could bring France into the war. And British commitments to France meant that French involvement could bring Britain into the war. The alliance system had created a mechanism for transforming a Balkan crisis into a European catastrophe. There had been crises before that had been resolved without general war. In 1905 and 1911, Disputes over Morocco had brought France and Germany to the brink but been resolved through diplomacy. In 1908, Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina had created a crisis with Serbia and Russia but had been diffused. In 1912 and 1913, the Balkan Wars had been localized despite great power involvement. Each time, diplomacy had prevailed. Each time, war had been avoided. This created a dangerous complacency. Leaders began to believe that they could push hard in crises and always pull back from the brink at the last moment. They underestimated how fragile the peace really was. They did not understand that the very structure of the international system made general war increasingly likely with each crisis that was successfully managed. They were playing with fire and did not know it. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visited Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The date was significant. It was the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a date of enormous symbolic importance to Serbian nationalists, marking Serbia's medieval defeat by the Ottomans. The Archduke's visit on this date was seen as a deliberate provocation. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie rode in an open car through the streets of Sarajevo. A group of young Bosnian Serb nationalists, armed and trained by Serbian military intelligence, waited along the route. The first attempt, a bomb thrown at the Archduke's car, failed, injuring people in the following car but not the Archduke. The motorcade continued to the city hall where official ceremonies proceeded. Incredibly, after the assassination attempt, the Archduke decided to visit the wounded from the bombing in the hospital. On the way, the driver took a wrong turn. When he tried to reverse, the car stalled directly in front of Gavrilo Princip, one of the conspirators, who had positioned himself along what he thought would be the return route. Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots from a pistol. One bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck. The other struck Sophie in the abdomen. Both died within the hour. The shots fired by a 19-year-old nationalist in a Balkan backwater would set in motion a catastrophe that would destroy the world of empires and claim over 20 million lives. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was shocking, but it did not immediately make war inevitable. There had been political assassinations before that had not led to general war. The King of Italy had been assassinated in 1900, the King of Portugal in 1908, the Russian Prime Minister in 1911. Each time the crisis had been contained, but this time would be different. The response to the assassination by Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany and challenged by Russia and its allies, would transform a terrorist act into the greatest catastrophe Europe had ever experienced. The month between the assassination on June 28 and the outbreak of general war in early August became known as the July Crisis, for weeks during which the leaders of Europe sleepwalked into disaster. In Vienna, the assassination was seen not just as a tragedy but as an opportunity. The heir to the throne had been murdered by terrorists linked to Serbia. This was intolerable. More than that, it provided the perfect justification for finally dealing with the Serbian problem once and for all. For years, Austria-Hungary had debated what to do about Serbia, whose very existence as an independent Slavic state inspired nationalist movements within the empire. The empire's chief of staff, Franz Conrad von Hitzendorf, had advocated war with Serbia dozens of times. Now, with the Archduke's blood barely dry, Conrad and others argued that Austria-Hungary must act decisively. But there was a problem. Any military action against Serbia risked Russian intervention. Russia saw itself as the protector of the Slavic peoples and had backed down in previous crises. Would Russia back down again, or would it fight? The Austro-Hungarians could not be sure. The key was Germany. If Germany backed Austria-Hungary, then Austria-Hungary could act, and if Russia intervened, Germany would help fight Russia. Without German support, Austria-Hungary dared not move. In the days after the assassination, Austro-Hungarian officials consulted with their German allies. The response from Berlin exceeded their hopes. Kaiser Wilhelm II and his government essentially gave Austria-Hungary a blank check. They assured Vienna that Germany would support Austria-Hungary whatever action it decided to take, even if that action led to war with Russia. This was an extraordinarily reckless commitment. The Germans were encouraging Austria-Hungary to risk a general European war. Why did they do it? The reasons were complex. Some German leaders believed that Russia would back down again, that the crisis could be localized. Others believed that war with Russia was inevitable eventually and that it was better to fight now while Germany still had military advantages. Still others believed that the alliance system demanded unwavering support for Austria-Hungary regardless of the risks. Whatever the reasons, the German blank check made war far more likely. With German backing assured, Austria-Hungary drafted an ultimatum to Serbia that was deliberately designed to be unacceptable. The ultimatum accused Serbia of tolerating anti-Austrian propaganda and terrorist organizations. It demanded that Serbia suppress all anti-Austrian propaganda, dissolve nationalist organizations, dismiss officials deemed hostile to Austria-Hungary, and most controversially, allow Austro-Hungarian officials to participate in the investigation and suppression of subversive movements on Serbian soil. This last demand was a direct violation of Serbian sovereignty. No independent nation could accept foreign officials operating on its territory with police powers. The ultimatum was delivered on July 23 with a 48-hour deadline for response. The short deadline was calculated to prevent diplomatic intervention by other powers. Austria-Hungary wanted a war with Serbia and was determined to have it. In Belgrade, the Serbian government faced an impossible choice. Accepting the ultimatum would mean surrendering sovereignty. Rejecting it would mean war with Austria-Hungary. Serbia appealed to Russia for support. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II and his government had to decide whether to support Serbia or abandon it. The pressures were enormous. Russian public opinion and the press were overwhelmingly pro-Serbian. To abandon Serbia would be humiliating and would destroy Russia's credibility as a great power and protector of the Slavs, but supporting Serbia might mean war with Austria-Hungary and Germany. The Russians tried to walk a tightrope. They assured Serbia of support while trying to negotiate with Vienna. When Serbia delivered its response to the ultimatum on July 25, it accepted most of the demands but rejected the clause about Austrian officials operating on Serbian soil. Serbia offered to submit the dispute to international arbitration. It was a moderate response that accepted Austrian concerns while defending Serbian sovereignty. But for Austria-Hungary, which wanted war, it was not enough. Vienna immediately broke diplomatic relations with Belgrade and began mobilizing its army. The mobilization of Austria-Hungary's forces set in motion the rigid war plans and railway timetables that would make peace impossible. Russia faced a terrible dilemma. If it did nothing while Austria-Hungary crushed Serbia, Russia's credibility as a great power would be destroyed. But Russian mobilization would be seen by Germany as an act of aggression, likely triggering German mobilization and war. The Russian military argued that partial mobilization against Austria-Hungary alone was technically impossible. The railway system and mobilization plans were designed for full mobilization against both Austria-Hungary and Germany. To mobilize against one was to mobilize against both. On July 30th, despite the Tsar's initial hesitation, Russia ordered full mobilization. It was a fateful decision. Once the Russian mobilization began, the dominoes started falling with terrifying speed. Germany responded to Russian mobilization by issuing ultimatums. Russia must halt its mobilization within 12 hours or Germany would mobilize. France, Russia's ally, was asked what it would do in the event of a Russo-German war. The French government replied that France would act according to its interests, a diplomatic way of saying it would support Russia. When the deadlines passed without Russian compliance, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's strategy for fighting a two-front war, required a rapid offensive through Belgium to knock France out of the war before Russia could fully mobilize. On August 2nd, Germany demanded that Belgium allow German troops free passage through its territory. Belgium, whose neutrality had been guaranteed by treaty including by Germany itself, refused. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France and invaded Belgium. Britain had treaty obligations to defend Belgian neutrality and had informal commitments to support France. More fundamentally, British leaders believed that German domination of the continent would threaten British security. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. Within a week, the great powers of Europe were at war. The alliance system had worked exactly as designed, transforming a Balkan dispute into a continental catastrophe. But the leaders who had made these decisions did not understand what they had unleashed. They thought they were fighting a conventional war that would be over quickly. They believed in short war illusions. The German Kaiser told his troops they would be home before the leaves fell from the trees. The French spoke of offensive spirit in Elon that would bring swift victory. The Russians counted on their vast numbers to crush the Central Powers. The British believed their economic power and naval supremacy would strangle Germany. Almost no one anticipated the horror that was coming. Almost no one imagined that this war would last for years, consume millions of lives, bankrupt nations, topple empires, and destroy the civilization that had created it. The public reaction to the outbreak of war shocked many observers. There were massive demonstrations in favor of war in every capital. Crowds cheered, sang patriotic songs, and volunteered for military service in numbers that overwhelmed recruiting stations. Socialists, who had promised international solidarity in opposition to war, supported their national governments almost everywhere. The Second International, the organization of socialist parties, collapsed as German socialists voted for war credits and French socialists joined a government of national unity. Trade unions called off strikes. Political parties declared truces. The nations of Europe were uniting in support of war with an enthusiasm that seemed almost incomprehensible in retrospect. Later, historians would debate how genuine this enthusiasm was, whether it was as universal as contemporary accounts suggested, whether working-class people really embraced the war or were swept along by elite manufactured consent. But there is no doubt that significant numbers of people in every warring nation welcomed the war, at least initially. They saw it as a great adventure, a test of national character, an opportunity for glory. They had no conception of what industrial warfare would actually mean. The initial military operations confirmed the short war illusions for some but contradicted them for others. Germany's invasion of Belgium was brutal. When Belgian civilians fired on German troops, the Germans retaliated with harsh reprisals, executing civilians and burning towns. The ancient university city of Louvain was burned, its library containing irreplaceable medieval manuscripts destroyed. These atrocities, real and exaggerated, became powerful propaganda weapons for the Allies, portraying Germany as a barbaric nation that violated treaties and murdered innocents. German forces swept through Belgium and into northern France with terrifying speed. The French army launched its own offensive into Alsace-Lorraine according to Plan 17, advancing with bands playing and flags flying. They were slaughtered by German machine guns and artillery. French soldiers in their bright blue coats and red trousers made perfect targets. In the first month of the war, France suffered over 300,000 casualties. The doctrine of offensive spirit proved to be nothing more than a recipe for suicide against modern firepower. By early September, German forces were within 30 miles of Paris. The French government fled to Bordeaux. It seemed that the Schlieffen Plan might succeed, that France might be knocked out of the war in 6 weeks as planned. But the Germans had modified the Schlieffen Plan from its original version, weakening the right wing that was supposed to sweep around Paris. German troops were exhausted from weeks of marching and fighting. Supply lines were stretched, and the French, backed by the British Expeditionary Force, counterattacked at the Marne River. The First Battle of the Marne, fought from September 6 to 12, stopped the German advance. The Germans retreated to defensive positions along the Aisne River. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. France had not been knocked out of the war. Both sides now tried to outflank each other in what became known as the Race to the Sea, extending the line of trenches northward toward the English Channel. By November, the Western Front had stabilized into a continuous line of trenches stretching from Switzerland to the sea. The war of movement was over. The war of attrition in the trenches was beginning, and it would prove to be far worse than anyone had imagined. The trench systems that emerged on the Western Front in late 1914 would define the war for the next 4 years. What had begun as simple defensive ditches evolved into elaborate networks of fortifications that stretched across France and Belgium. The frontline trenches where soldiers lived and fought were backed by support trenches and reserve trenches connected by communication trenches. Barbed wire, sometimes in belts 50 yards deep, protected the trenches from infantry assault. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Artillery batteries positioned miles behind the lines could rain shells on any sector. Between the opposing trench lines lay no man's land, a blasted wasteland of shell craters, mud, and corpses, varying in width from a few dozen yards to several hundred. Crossing no man's land under fire became the defining nightmare of the war. Life in the trenches was a special kind of hell. Soldiers lived in conditions of medieval squalor combined with modern industrial slaughter. The trenches were narrow, muddy, and infested with rats that grew fat feeding on the dead. Lice were everywhere, tormenting soldiers and spreading disease. In wet weather, which was frequent in northern France and Belgium, the trenches filled with water and mud. Soldiers stood in water for days, developing trenchfoot, a condition where the feet literally began to rot. The stench was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, rotting corpses, poison gas, and the sulfur smell of explosives. Men could not bathe for weeks. They slept when they could in dugouts carved into the trench walls or in funk holes, shallow caves scraped into the mud. Sleep was nearly impossible during bombardments, which could last for hours or days. The psychological strain was immense and unending. The daily routine in the trenches was simultaneously monotonous and terrifying. Soldiers stood sentry duty, repaired trenches damaged by shelling, filled sandbags, strengthened barbed wire, and tried to survive. Dawn and dusk were the most dangerous times, when attacks were most likely. So soldiers stood to arms at these hours, peering over the parapet at no man's land, rifles ready. Snipers on both sides waited for anyone careless enough to expose themselves. Artillery fire could come at any moment, shells screaming in without warning to explode among the men. High explosive shells created blast waves that could kill without leaving a mark, rupturing internal organs. Shrapnel shells exploded in the air, sending thousands of metal balls down onto anyone in the open. The constant threat of sudden death wore down even the bravest men. Some soldiers developed shell shock, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak or function. Others simply broke mentally, staring blankly or weeping uncontrollably. The generals had not anticipated trench warfare and initially had no idea how to break the deadlock. Their solution was simple and horrifying. They would attack. Massive artillery bombardments would destroy the enemy trenches and cut the barbed wire. Then infantry would advance across no man's land, occupy the destroyed trenches, and break through to open country where cavalry could exploit the breakthrough. At least that was the theory. In practice, it never worked. The artillery bombardments warned the enemy that an attack was coming and gave them time to bring up reserves. The bombardments rarely destroyed the deep German dugouts where soldiers sheltered during the shelling. The barbed wire was often merely rearranged rather than destroyed, and the bombardments churned up the ground, creating a lunar landscape of shell craters that made advance even more difficult. When the whistle blew and soldiers went over the top, they faced machine guns, artillery, and uncut barbed wire. The slaughter was industrial in scale. The Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915 was one of the first British attempts to break through the German lines. After a massive bombardment, British and Indian troops attacked and initially made progress, capturing the village. But German reinforcements arrived, the advance stalled, and a counterattack pushed the British back. The result was typical of trench warfare: 12,000 British and Indian casualties and 3,000 German casualties for no strategic gain whatsoever. A few weeks later, the Germans launched an attack at Ypres in Belgium, and they brought something new to the battlefield. On April 22nd, German forces released chlorine gas from cylinders, creating a greenish-yellow cloud that drifted toward Allied trenches. The gas caused horrible suffering, burning lungs and eyes, causing men to choke and suffocate. The French colonial troops facing the gas attack broke and ran, opening a 4-mile gap in the Allied line. But the Germans had not anticipated how successful the gas would be and had insufficient reserves to exploit the breakthrough. The line was restored. The gas attack had achieved tactical surprise but no strategic result. The use of poison gas was a watershed moment. It violated international law and basic notions of civilized warfare. But all sides quickly adopted it. The Allies developed their own gas weapons, and gas masks became standard equipment. Chlorine was followed by phosgene and then by mustard gas, each more deadly or debilitating than the last. Mustard gas was particularly horrible, causing chemical burns and blisters wherever it touched skin, and could persist in soil for days or weeks. Gas attacks became routine. The sight of soldiers stumbling blind from gas, lungs destroyed, became one of the war's most disturbing images. Wilfred Owen, the British poet who would die just days before the war's end, captured the horror in his poem Dulci et decorum est, describing a soldier dying from gas as guttering, choking, drowning. The war that had begun with horses and cavalry charges had descended into chemical weapons and mass slaughter. In May 1915, Italy entered the war on the Allied side. Lured by promises of territorial gains from Austria-Hungary, the Italian front in the Alps became yet another killing ground. The Italians launched 11 offensives along the Isonzo River between 1915 and 1917, each ending in failure and massive casualties. The terrain was mountainous and favored defense. Austrian positions on high ground could rain fire down on Italian attackers. The battles on the Isonzo demonstrated that the problems of trench warfare were not unique to the Western Front. Everywhere, defense dominated offense. Everywhere, the machine gun and artillery ruled the battlefield. Everywhere, generals ordered attacks that resulted in slaughter for minimal gain. The Italian commander Luigi Cadorna was particularly incompetent and callous, demanding attacks regardless of conditions and executing soldiers for cowardice to encourage the others. Italy would suffer over 600,000 dead before the war ended, most of them in futile attacks on the Isonzo. The Eastern Front was different from the Western Front in important ways. The front was much longer, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and the armies had more room to maneuver. There were no continuous trench lines as in the West. Battles were more fluid, with dramatic advances and retreats covering hundreds of miles. But the scale of death was just as horrific. Russia had mobilized faster than Germany expected, invading East Prussia in August 1914. The Germans, though outnumbered, won stunning victories at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, destroying 2 Russian armies and establishing the reputation of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff as military geniuses. But Russia's vast manpower meant it could absorb terrible losses and keep fighting. In 1915, a combined German and Austro-Hungarian offensive drove deep into Russian territory, capturing Poland and inflicting over 2 million Russian casualties. Yet Russia did not collapse. Its armies retreated but remained intact. The war at sea was equally crucial, though less visible. Britain's naval blockade of Germany aimed to starve the Central Powers into submission by cutting off food and raw materials. The blockade was ruthlessly effective. German civilians suffered terribly from food shortages. Hundreds of thousands would die from malnutrition and diseases related to malnutrition by the war's end. The winter of 1916-17 became known as the turnip winter in Germany because turnips were the only food available in quantity. Germany responded with submarine warfare, using U-boats to sink merchant ships bringing supplies to Britain. Submarine warfare raised difficult questions about international law and neutral rights. Under traditional rules, warships were supposed to stop merchant vessels, search them, and allow crews to abandon ship before sinking them. But submarines were vulnerable on the surface. Their effectiveness required attacking without warning. This meant that neutral ships and even passenger liners were at risk. The sinking of the British passenger liner Lusitania in May 1915 by a German U-boat killed nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. The outcry in the United States was enormous. President Woodrow Wilson, who had declared American neutrality, warned Germany that further attacks on passenger ships would have serious consequences. Germany scaled back its submarine campaign, fearing American entry into the war, but the submarine question would return. Germany's naval commanders argued that unrestricted submarine warfare could starve Britain into surrender before America could intervene decisively. It was a calculation that would prove catastrophically wrong. By the end of 1915, the war had already exceeded all predictions. Millions were dead. Entire economies were being reorganized for total war. The enthusiasm of August 1914 had given way to grim determination or growing disillusionment, and there was no end in sight. The generals planned more offensives for 1916, convinced that the next big push would bring breakthrough and victory. They were wrong. 1916 would bring the bloodiest battles in human history up to that point. Battles that would symbolize the entire war's futility and horror. Verdun and the Somme were coming. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, planned an offensive for 1916 that was horrifying in its cold logic. He believed that France was near breaking point and that Britain, France's main ally, could not be decisively defeated as long as the French army remained intact. His strategy was not to break directly through the French lines, but to gradually wear down France's military capacity. He intended to concentrate attacks on a location that, for symbolic and strategic reasons, the French army would feel compelled to defend intensely. This would lead France to commit a large portion of its forces to that point, while Germany would use its superiority in artillery to maintain constant pressure. Over time, this prolonged effort would reduce France's ability to continue the conflict, paving the way for peace negotiations. The target Falkenhayn chose was the fortress city of Verdun, located on the Meuse River in northeastern France. Verdun had symbolic importance dating back centuries. More practically, it formed a salient in the French lines that could be attacked from three sides and its defenders subjected to converging artillery fire. The operation was cynically named Gericht, meaning place of execution or judgment. The Battle of Verdun began on February 21, 1916, with a bombardment of unprecedented intensity. German guns fired over 1 million shells into the French positions on the first day alone. The bombardment was meant to pulverize the French fortifications and annihilate the defenders. For 9 hours, shells rained down continuously. Trees were splintered into matchsticks, trenches were obliterated, entire companies of French soldiers were buried alive or blown to pieces. When the German infantry advanced, they expected to find only corpses. Instead, they found French soldiers, dazed and deafened, but still fighting. The French forts, massive concrete and steel structures built after the 1870 defeat, proved more resilient than expected. But the German advance made steady progress, capturing key positions including Fort Douaumont, the largest fort in the Verdun complex, which fell on February 25 with barely a fight because it was inadequately garrisoned. The French command faced a crisis. Should they abandon Verdun and straighten their lines, or should they defend it regardless of cost? General Philippe Pétain, assigned to command the defense, made the fateful decision to hold. Verdun would not fall. The French army would defend every foot of ground. Pétain organized a supply line along a single road from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, the Voie Sacrée or Sacred Way, along which trucks carried men and supplies to the front and carried the dead and wounded back. The road became the lifeline of Verdun. Thousands of trucks rumbled along it day and night. Almost the entire French army would eventually serve at Verdun. Units rotated in and out of the hell of the front line. Pétain's policy of rotation distributed the suffering across the whole army rather than destroying a few divisions completely. But it also meant that more French soldiers experienced the horror of Verdun, carrying the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. The battle became an inferno of artillery fire, unlike anything seen before. The Germans fired approximately 22 million shells at Verdun over 10 months. The French fired nearly as many in response. The landscape was transformed into something resembling the surface of the moon. A wilderness of overlapping shell craters filled with water and corpses. Trees ceased to exist. Villages were erased from the map, literally vaporized by shellfire. Soldiers lived and fought in conditions beyond comprehension. They sheltered in shell holes. They scrambled over corpses. They breathed air thick with poison gas and pulverized stone and flesh. Water was contaminated. Food was scarce and often spoiled. Men went mad from the shelling, from lack of sleep, from the proximity of death. The French coined the phrase "they shall not pass" as a rallying cry. German soldiers spoke of the hell of Verdun and the mincing machine that consumed men without distinction. Fort Vaux, another key fortress, fell to the Germans in June after a siege in which the defenders fought with incredible courage despite being without water, reduced to licking moisture off the walls. The commandant, Major Sylvain Eugene Renel, surrendered only when further resistance was impossible, and the German commander saluted his bravery. But the German advance was slowing, the casualties were mounting on both sides, and Falkenhayn's plan to bleed France white was bleeding Germany nearly as badly. The ratio of losses was not in Germany's favor. In July, Pétain's replacement as sector commander, Robert Nivelle, began counterattacks that gradually reclaimed lost ground. By December, when the battle finally ended, the French had retaken almost all the territory lost, including Fort Douaumont. The battle had accomplished nothing strategically. The lines were essentially where they had been in February, but the cost was staggering. Estimates vary, but approximately 300,000 French and German soldiers died at Verdun, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. For what? For a few square miles of devastated landscape that changed hands multiple times before returning to the status quo. While Verdun raged, the British planned their own offensive to relieve pressure on the French and break through German lines. The attack would come along the Somme River, not because the terrain was favorable, which it was not, but because it was where British and French sectors met. The British commander, Douglas Haig, was convinced that a massive bombardment followed by infantry assault would break the German lines. The bombardment lasted 7 days, from June 24 to July 1, 1916. The British fired over 1.6 million shells, so many that the sound could be heard in England across the Channel. British soldiers were told that nothing could survive such a bombardment, that they would simply walk across no man's land and occupy the destroyed German positions, that the barbed wire would be cut and the Germans dead or cowering. They were told to advance in waves at a walking pace, maintaining formation. It was all tragically, criminally wrong. On the morning of July 1, 1916, at 7:30, whistles blew along 13 miles of British front. Soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began walking toward German lines. The bombardment had not destroyed the German positions. The Germans had built deep dugouts, some 40 feet underground, where they sheltered during the shelling. The bombardment had not cut the barbed wire. Much of the British artillery ammunition was defective, failing to explode, and the Germans were not cowering. They emerged from their dugouts, set up their machine guns, and opened fire on the advancing British infantry. The British soldiers were slaughtered. They fell in rows. Entire battalions were destroyed in minutes. Some units suffered 90% casualties before even reaching German barbed wire. By the end of the first day, the British Army had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including almost 20,000 dead. It was the worst single day in British military history. Despite this catastrophe, Haig continued the offensive for 4.5 more months. Attack after attack was launched. Tanks were used for the first time in September, a new weapon that could cross trenches and crush barbed wire, but they were used in small numbers and were mechanically unreliable. Some attacks made small gains. A few villages were captured. The Germans were pushed back a few miles in some sectors, but the breakthrough never came. When the battle finally ended in November, the British and French had advanced roughly 6 miles at the deepest point of penetration. The cost was over 1 million casualties on all sides, split roughly equally between the Allies and Germany. British and Commonwealth forces suffered over 420,000 casualties. French forces about 200,000. German forces between 450 and 600,000 depending on the source. An entire generation of young British men was being destroyed. The PALS battalions, units formed from men who enlisted together from the same towns and cities, were wiped out, devastating entire communities back home. The battles of Verdun and the Somme defined 1916 and in many ways defined the entire war. They demonstrated the complete bankruptcy of offensive tactics. Frontal assault against entrenched machine guns and artillery was nothing more than mass murder. Yet the generals kept ordering such attacks, convinced that the next one would succeed, that the enemy was close to breaking, that one more push would bring victory. The soldiers who survived these battles were never the same. They had seen things that destroyed faith in humanity, in progress, in civilization itself. They had watched their friends die in ways too horrible to describe. They had killed other men who were just as frightened and miserable as they were. The gap between the soldiers' experience and the understanding of civilians back home became unbridgeable. How could anyone who had not been there understand what Verdun or the Somme was like? How could words describe the reality of industrial slaughter? The year 1916 also saw changes on the Eastern Front and elsewhere. Russia launched the Brusilov offensive in June, a massive attack on Austria-Hungary that was initially spectacularly successful, advancing hundreds of miles and taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners. It was the most successful Allied offensive of the entire war, but lack of supplies and German reinforcements eventually stopped the advance. The offensive costs Russia over 1 million casualties, losses it could not sustain. The Austro-Hungarian army was shattered and never fully recovered, becoming increasingly dependent on German support. Romania, encouraged by Russian successes, entered the war on the Allied side in August, but was quickly defeated by German forces. The Ottoman Empire continued fighting in the Middle East and the Caucasus. At sea, the Battle of Jutland in May, the only major naval battle between the British and German fleets, ended inconclusively with both sides claiming victory but the strategic situation unchanged. By the end of 1916, the war had become a test of endurance. Which side could bear the losses longer? Which society would collapse first under the strain of total war? Germany was suffering from the British blockade. Food shortages were becoming acute, but the Allied offensives had failed to break through. Russia was showing signs of strain, its economy disrupted, its population war-weary, its government increasingly dysfunctional. Austria-Hungary was barely holding together, its multi-ethnic empire straining under the pressures of war. France had held at Verdun but at tremendous cost. The army was exhausted and morale was fragile. Britain was still mobilizing its full strength, but the losses on the Somme had shocked the nation. The question was, which side would break first? The answer would come in 1917, the year of crisis and revolution, when the strain of war would topple empires and transform the conflict in ways no one anticipated. The world that had existed in 1914 was already dead. What would replace it remained to be seen. Russia entered 1917, exhausted and on the brink of collapse. The war had placed impossible strains on the Russian Empire. Millions of men had been mobilized, depleting the agricultural workforce and causing food shortages. The railway system, inadequate even in peacetime, was breaking down under the demands of moving troops and supplies to the front. Inflation was rampant. Cities faced bread shortages. The government was corrupt and incompetent, headed by Tsar Nicholas II. who was well-meaning but weak and dominated by his wife Alexandra and the infamous mystic Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin's malign influence over the royal family, combined with rumors of the empress's German sympathies, destroyed what little confidence the Russian people had in their government. In December 1916, a group of nobles murdered Rasputin, hoping to save the monarchy. They were too late. The damage was done. In early March 1917, using the old Russian calendar, it was late February. Demonstrations broke out in Petrograd, as St. Petersburg had been renamed to sound less German. The immediate cause was bread shortages, but the underlying cause was 3 years of war, death and suffering with no end in sight. Women textile workers went on strike on International Women's Day. The strike spread. Workers from other factories joined. Soon, hundreds of thousands of people were in the streets demanding bread and an end to the war. The demonstrations were not organized by any revolutionary party. They were spontaneous explosions of popular anger. The Tsarist government ordered troops to disperse the crowds. Some units obeyed, firing on demonstrators and killing dozens, but other units refused to fire on their own people. Soldiers mutinied, joining the demonstrators. The garrison of Petrograd, over 100,000 men, went over to the revolution. The Tsar's government dissolved in a matter of days. Nicholas II, who was at military headquarters when the revolution began, tried to return to Petrograd, but his train was stopped. Members of the Duma, the Russian parliament, formed a provisional government to restore order. They asked the Tsar to abdicate. On March 15th, Nicholas II, the ruler of the largest empire on earth, gave up his throne. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 3 centuries, ended not with dramatic battle but with a quiet signature on a piece of paper in a railway car. Nicholas abdicated for himself and his son, hoping his brother would take the throne. His brother wisely refused. Russia became a republic. The Allied powers, Britain and France, were relieved. They had been uncomfortable being allied with an autocratic empire while fighting for democracy. Now Russia was a democracy, or so it seemed. The problem was that the provisional government had competition for power. In Petrograd and other cities, workers and soldiers formed Soviets, councils that claimed to represent the people. The Petrograd Soviet, dominated by socialist parties, issued Order No. 1, which stated that soldiers should obey only orders that did not contradict the Soviets' orders. This created dual power, with both the provisional government and the Soviet claiming authority. The provisional government was dominated by liberals and moderate socialists who wanted to continue the war and establish a Western-style democracy. The Soviet was more radical, demanding immediate peace and social revolution. Neither institution had full control. Russia descended into a kind of organized chaos, with different groups contending for power while the war continued. The provisional government's decision to continue fighting was probably its fatal mistake. The Russian people wanted peace. Continuing the war meant that the government's legitimacy would rest on military success, and there would be no military success. Into this volatile situation arrived Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was the leader of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party, a committed Marxist revolutionary who had spent years in exile. When revolution broke out, Lenin was in Switzerland. The Germans, hoping to further destabilize Russia, allowed Lenin and other revolutionaries to travel through Germany in a sealed train to Russia. It was one of history's most consequential train journeys. Lenin arrived in Petrograd in April and immediately began arguing for a more radical revolution. His April theses called for no support to the provisional government, immediate peace, transfer of power to the Soviets, and nationalization of land and industry. Most Bolsheviks thought Lenin had gone too far, but he gradually won them over. Lenin understood something that other socialist leaders did not. The Russian people were ready for radical change. They were tired of suffering for goals they did not understand. They wanted peace, land, and bread. Whichever party gave them these things would gain their support. In July, premature uprisings in Petrograd, partially supported by the Bolsheviks, were suppressed by the provisional government. Lenin went into hiding in Finland. The government, now led by Alexander Kerensky, a socialist lawyer, appeared to have stabilized the situation, but appearances were deceiving. In the countryside, peasants were seizing land from nobles without waiting for legal authorization. In the cities, workers were taking over factories. In the army, discipline was collapsing. Soldiers were deserting en masse, walking away from the front to return home. The provisional government's authority existed mostly on paper. In September, the commander of the Russian army, General Leva Kornilov, attempted a coup, marching on Petrograd to restore order. Kerensky, desperate, armed the Bolsheviks and other radicals to defend the city. The coup collapsed when Kornilov's troops refused to fight, but the incident destroyed what little credibility the provisional government had left. The army could not be trusted. The right saw Kerensky as a traitor. The left saw him as weak. By October, Lenin judged that the time was right for the Bolsheviks to seize power. The provisional government was isolated and weak. The Bolsheviks had gained majorities in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. On the night of November 6 to 7th, using the new calendar, it was October 24th to 25th in the old calendar, Bolshevik Red Guards and revolutionary soldiers seized key points in Petrograd, including bridges, telegraph offices, and railway stations. The operation was organized by Leon Trotsky and was almost bloodless. The ministers of the provisional government were in the Winter Palace, defended by a women's battalion and some military cadets. The attackers surrounded the palace and eventually stormed it. The ministers were arrested. Kerensky escaped and tried to organize resistance but failed. In Moscow, there was more fighting, but within a few days, the Bolsheviks controlled both capitals. Lenin emerged from hiding and declared that Soviet power had been established. The Bolshevik Revolution, the event that would shape the 20th century as much as the war itself, had succeeded. The Bolsheviks immediately began implementing their program. They issued a decree on peace, calling for immediate negotiations to end the war without annexations or indemnities. They issued a decree on land, legalizing the peasant seizures of noble estates. They promised that a constituent assembly would be elected to determine Russia's future government. But when the constituent assembly was elected in November and the Bolsheviks won only a quarter of the seats, with the socialist revolutionaries winning a majority, Lenin simply dissolved it by force in January 1918. The Bolsheviks had no intention of sharing power or allowing democracy to overturn their revolution. They established a one-party dictatorship and began suppressing opposition. The Cheka, the secret police, was created to hunt down counter-revolutionaries. Civil war was beginning even as the external war continued. Lenin was determined to take Russia out of the war regardless of the cost. He entered negotiations with Germany at Brest-Litovsk. The German terms were harsh. Germany demanded that Russia cede Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, and other territories. These lands contained a third of Russia's population, a third of its agricultural land, and most of its industry. The Bolsheviks were divided. Some wanted to continue fighting a revolutionary war. Trotsky proposed a policy of neither peace nor war, demobilizing but not signing a treaty. Lenin argued that Russia had no choice. The army had disintegrated. Continuing the war would lead to the Bolsheviks' overthrow. The revolution had to be saved even at the cost of accepting a humiliating peace. When the Germans resumed their advance to demonstrate they could take what they wanted by force, Lenin prevailed. On March 3, 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed. Russia gave up vast territories and exited the war. The Russian Revolution and Russia's exit from the war transformed the strategic situation. For Germany, it was a tremendous victory. The two-front war was over. Germany could move troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. German forces occupied Ukraine and seized its grain and resources. The peace in the East gave Germany one last chance to win the war before American forces arrived in strength. For the Allies, it was a disaster. They had lost their major ally. German divisions that had been fighting Russia were now moving west. Worse, the Bolshevik Revolution threatened to spread. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were committed internationalists who believed the revolution must become global. They called on workers everywhere to overthrow their governments and end the war. Communist revolutions broke out in Germany and Hungary after the war. Even during the war, strikes and mutinies in Allied countries took inspiration from Russia. The specter of Bolshevism haunted Allied leaders. The impact of the Russian Revolution extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The revolution represented the first collapse of one of the great empires that had begun the war. The Russian Empire, which had seemed so vast and powerful, had dissolved into chaos in a matter of months. The strain of war had been too much. The government had been too incompetent. The people had been too desperate. And now Russia had fallen to a radical socialist government that rejected everything the old order stood for. It was a warning to the other empires still fighting. If Russia could collapse, so could they. The social contracts that held these empires together were fracturing under the pressures of total war. Soldiers were asking why they should die for distant goals while their families starved. Workers were asking why they should endure hardship while elites profited. Nationalists in Austria-Hungary were asking why they should remain loyal to a dynasty that sent them to die for German goals. The center could not hold, and 1917 would bring more crises and more collapses. The Allied position in 1917 appeared increasingly desperate. The French army, after yet another failed offensive under General Robert Nivelle in April and May that cost hundreds of thousands of casualties for minimal gains, experienced widespread mutinies. Entire divisions refused to attack. Soldiers were not deserting or surrendering to the Germans, but they would not participate in more futile offensives. The mutinies were suppressed with a combination of harsh punishment, including executions, and promises of better conditions and no more senseless attacks. Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, took command and restored discipline, but the French army was no longer capable of major offensives. Britain would have to carry the burden on the Western Front. In Italy, the Austro-Hungarian army, reinforced by German divisions, launched an offensive at Caporetto in October and smashed through Italian lines, advancing 70 miles and taking 300,000 prisoners. It was a catastrophic defeat that brought Italy to the brink of collapse. At sea, Germany made the fateful decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917. The German High Command calculated that submarines could starve Britain into surrender within 6 months, before America could intervene decisively. They knew that unrestricted submarine warfare would bring America into the war. President Woodrow Wilson had warned that it would. but they believed they could win before American forces arrived in significant numbers. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. America's entry would eventually tip the balance decisively against Germany. Fresh American troops and America's industrial might would overwhelm the Central Powers. But in 1917, American forces were still being trained and equipped. It would be months before they arrived at the front in large numbers. Germany had a window of opportunity. If they could win before American strength was fully deployed, they could still achieve victory. The stage was set for the war's climactic battles in 1918. When the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, it marked a turning point in the conflict, though not an immediate one. America was unprepared for war on the scale being fought in Europe. The United States Army numbered about 100,000 men, smaller than Belgium's army had been in 1914. The country had no experience with mass mobilization or fighting a major European war. Weapons, equipment, training facilities, all had to be created almost from scratch. General John Pershing was appointed commander of the American Expeditionary Forces and sailed for France in June, but he brought only a small staff with him. The actual fighting force would take months to arrive and longer to become combat-ready. President Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned for re-election in 1916 on the slogan "He kept us out of war," now had to convince the American people that this was a war worth fighting. Wilson framed American entry in idealistic terms. This was not about territorial gain or imperial rivalry. America was fighting to make the world safe for democracy. The war would end all wars and usher in a new international order based on justice and collective security rather than secret treaties and balance of power politics. Wilson's 14 points, announced in January 1918, outlined his vision for peace. They included freedom of the seas, free trade, reduction of armaments, adjustment of colonial claims with regard for the peoples involved, and most importantly, the establishment of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. These ideas inspired people around the world, particularly those under colonial rule who heard Wilson's rhetoric about self-determination and imagined independence. But they also created tensions with the European allies, who had made secret treaties promising territorial gains and had no intention of giving up their empires or accepting a peace without annexations. The American mobilization was remarkable. The Selective Service Act of May 1917 instituted a draft that would eventually register 24 million men and induct nearly 3 million into military service. Millions more volunteered. Training camps were built to house and train this massive influx of soldiers. American industry shifted to war production, manufacturing weapons, ammunition, aircraft, and ships in astounding quantities. The government took unprecedented control of the economy, setting prices, allocating resources, and coordinating production. Food production was increased and consumption reduced through rationing and voluntary meatless and wheatless days. Propaganda campaigns, led by the Committee on Public Information, saturated the country with posters, films, and speeches promoting the war effort and demonizing Germany. The Hun was portrayed as a barbaric monster raping Belgium and threatening civilization itself. But mobilization also brought repression. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 made it illegal to interfere with the draft or to say anything disloyal or abusive about the government, the flag, or the military. These laws were used to prosecute and imprison thousands of people, including socialists, pacifists, and German Americans. Socialist leader Eugene V. Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for a speech opposing the war. Newspapers and magazines critical of the war were shut down. Vigilante groups attacked German Americans and anyone suspected of disloyalty. German culture was purged from American life. German language instruction was banned in schools. German music was removed from concert programs. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage and hamburgers became Liberty Sandwiches. The war created a climate of intolerance and paranoia that foreshadowed later periods of American history. Dissent was equated with treason. Conformity was enforced through social pressure and legal coercion. While America mobilized, Germany prepared for its last chance at victory. With Russia out of the war, Germany could concentrate its forces in the West. The German High Command, now effectively controlled by Erich Ludendorff with Paul von Hindenburg as his nominal superior, planned a series of massive offensives for spring 1918. The goal was to break through Allied lines and win the war before American forces arrived in decisive numbers. Ludendorff developed new tactics called stormtrooper tactics or infiltration tactics. Rather than attacking along a broad front after lengthy bombardments, elite stormtrooper units would infiltrate enemy lines after short, intense bombardments, bypassing strongpoints and pushing deep into the enemy rear to disrupt command and supply. Regular infantry would follow to widen the breach and destroy bypassed strongpoints. These tactics had been successfully tested on the Eastern Front and at Caporetto. Now they would be tried on the Western Front. Operation Michael, the first of Ludendorff's offensives, began on March 21, 1918. After a 5-hour bombardment using high explosive and gas shells, German stormtroopers attacked along a 40-mile front in the Somme area, hitting the junction between British and French forces. The attack was spectacularly successful. Dense fog helped conceal the German advance. The stormtroopers infiltrated British positions, causing confusion and panic. Entire divisions were overrun. Within days, the Germans had advanced 40 miles, the largest territorial gain on the Western Front since 1914. They recaptured all the ground lost in the Somme battles and more. The British army was in crisis. For the first time, the Allied commanders agreed to unity of command under French General Ferdinand Foch, who was given authority to coordinate Allied operations. Desperate appeals went to America to send troops immediately, ready or not. But Operation Michael, despite its tactical success, failed strategically. The advance had been so rapid that German supply lines were stretched. Troops were exhausted, casualties had been heavy, and the British line, though bent, had not broken. The Germans had taken territory but had not destroyed the British army or captured vital objectives like the railway junction at Amiens. Ludendorff launched more offensives through spring and early summer. Operation Georgette in April targeted British positions in Flanders. Operation Blucher in May attacked French positions on the Aisne River and advanced to the Marne River, within 50 miles of Paris once again. Each offensive gained ground but failed to achieve breakthrough, and each offensive cost Germany casualties it could not replace. The German army was bleeding out in these attacks. Morale was deteriorating. Soldiers advancing through Allied positions found warehouses full of food and supplies, making them realize how much better equipped the Allies were and how desperate Germany's material situation had become. By this time, American forces were arriving in France in significant numbers. The first American units had seen combat in October 1917, and by spring 1918, thousands were arriving every week. General Pershing insisted that American forces fight as a unified army under American command, rather than being parceled out to reinforce British and French units. The Allies desperately wanted American replacements for their depleted units, but Pershing refused. He wanted America to have an independent voice in the eventual peace settlement, which required an independent army with its own sector. There were exceptions during the German offensives when American units were temporarily placed under Allied command in crisis situations, but generally Pershing got his way. The American First Army was formed in August 1918 with Pershing as its commander. America was now a full military partner in the coalition. American troops brought fresh energy but also inexperience. They suffered high casualties in their early battles, learning painful lessons about modern warfare. The Battle of Belleau Wood in June, where Marines fought German units in a forest north of the Marne, became legendary in American military history. The Marines attacked with incredible courage, suffering terrible casualties but eventually taking the wood after weeks of fighting. A Marine sergeant, asked by a French officer if his men would retreat, supposedly replied, "Retreat hell, we just got here." Whether the quote is accurate or not, it captured the American spirit. But courage was not enough against machine guns and artillery. Americans had to learn the same lessons that Europeans had learned through years of bitter experience. The cost of this education was paid in American blood. Still, American enthusiasm and confidence were infectious. The Allies, worn down by years of war, drew strength from their new partner. In Germany, the strain of war was becoming unbearable. The British blockade had created severe food shortages. Civilians were starving. The turnip winter of 1916-17 had been followed by equally harsh conditions. Disease was rampant. Spanish influenza, the pandemic that would eventually kill more people than the war itself, was beginning its deadly spread. The virus hit Germany particularly hard because of malnutrition that weakened immune systems. Strikes broke out in German cities in January 1918, with workers demanding peace and better conditions. The strikes were suppressed, but they revealed growing discontent. The government was losing control, and in the army, discipline was fraying. Soldiers were increasingly war-weary, wondering what they were fighting for and whether victory was possible. Ludendorff's offensives had raised hopes of winning the war, but those hopes were fading as the offensive stalled and casualties mounted. On July 15th, Germany launched what would be its final offensive, the Second Battle of the Marne. It failed almost immediately. The French, warned by intelligence and deserters, were prepared. German attacks were repulsed with heavy losses. 3 days later, the Allies counterattacked. French forces, supported by American divisions including the 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions, struck the German salient. Tanks led the assault, hundreds of them, supported by aircraft and artillery. The Germans were pushed back. For the first time since the German spring offensives began, the initiative passed decisively to the Allies. August 8th, when British forces attacked near Amiens with similar success, was called by Ludendorff the Black Day of the German army. German units surrendered en masse. Discipline collapsed in some sectors. Ludendorff knew that Germany could not win. The question was whether Germany could force a stalemate and negotiate a peace that preserved the empire and the army's honor, or whether Germany would face complete defeat and potential revolution. The endgame had begun. The Allied counteroffensive that began in July 1918, known as the 100 Days Offensive, would prove to be the war's final campaign. After 4 years of stalemate and futile attacks, the Allies finally achieved what had seemed impossible. They broke the German army. The offensive was not a single massive attack, but a series of coordinated blows along different sectors of the Western Front, preventing the Germans from concentrating their dwindling reserves. French, British, American, Canadian, and Australian forces all played crucial roles. The tactics that had failed so catastrophically earlier in the war, massed infantry assaults supported by artillery, now succeeded because of key differences. Artillery had become far more accurate through sound ranging and aerial observation. Tanks were available in large numbers and were mechanically more reliable. Aircraft provided reconnaissance and ground support. And crucially, the German army was exhausted, depleted, and demoralized while Allied forces were reinforced by fresh American troops. The Battle of Amiens on August 8 marked the beginning of the end. British and Commonwealth forces, spearheaded by Canadian and Australian divisions that had become elite assault troops, attacked with over 400 tanks. They achieved a total surprise. The Germans had no warning. The attack penetrated 7 miles on the first day, a stunning achievement by Western Front standards. German units surrendered en masse. Entire divisions ceased to exist as fighting formations. Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German army, not just because of the tactical defeat, but because of what it revealed about German morale. Soldiers were surrendering rather than fighting to the death. They were shouting at reinforcements being brought up to the front, calling them strikebreakers and asking why they were prolonging the war. The German army's will to fight was breaking. The Americans launched their first independent offensive at St. Mihiel on September 12. The goal was to eliminate a German salient that had existed since 1914. The attack was a success, though the Germans were already withdrawing to shorten their lines. American forces took 15,000 prisoners and advanced roughly 10 miles in 4 days. Pershing and his staff were jubilant. America had proven it could plan and execute major operations. But the ease of the victory was deceptive. The Germans had been retreating anyway. The real test came 2 weeks later when American forces attacked in the Meuse-Argonne sector, part of the coordinated Allied offensive. The Meuse-Argonne offensive would become the largest battle in American military history up to that point, involving over 1 million American soldiers. It would also be one of the bloodiest. The Meuse-Argonne region was heavily fortified. The Germans had for years to build defenses in depth. The terrain was difficult, with thick forests and steep hills. The American First Army attacked on September 26. Initial progress was good, but then the advance stalled as German resistance stiffened and American inexperience showed. Traffic jams developed on the roads. Units became lost in the forests. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and tanks broke down. The Americans were learning that breakthrough was harder than it looked. For 6 weeks, American forces battered against German defenses, taking heavy casualties. Over 26,000 Americans died in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, more than in the entire Vietnam War. But the Americans kept attacking, and slowly German resistance crumbled. By early November, American forces had broken through the main German defensive lines and were advancing toward the vital railway junction at Sedan. To the north, British and Canadian forces were achieving even more dramatic results. The Battle of the Canal du Nord and the breaking of the Hindenburg Line in late September represented some of the most impressive military achievements of the entire war. The Hindenburg Line was the main German defensive position, a system of trenches, barbed wire, concrete bunkers, and pillboxes that the Germans had considered impregnable. Canadian forces, supported by British units, assaulted the line at Cambrai. They used sophisticated combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, artillery, tanks, aircraft, and engineers. They broke through. The breakthrough at Cambrai opened the way for a rapid advance. Throughout October, British and Commonwealth forces pushed the Germans back, liberating dozens of French and Belgian towns. The Germans were in full retreat, fighting desperate rearguard actions to slow the Allied advance but unable to stop it. In the south, French forces were also advancing. And in Italy, the Italians were finally achieving success against Austria-Hungary. The Battle of Vittorio Veneto, which began on October 24th, the anniversary of the Caporetto disaster, saw Italian forces supported by British and French divisions smash through Austro-Hungarian lines. The Austro-Hungarian army, composed of many different nationalities, was disintegrating as Czech, Polish, and South Slav soldiers deserted or mutinied, no longer willing to fight for an empire that was clearly dying. Austria-Hungary's multi-ethnic structure, once a source of strength, had become a fatal weakness. Nationalist movements were declaring independence. The empire was collapsing from within even as its armies were defeated in the field. In Germany, the realization that the war was lost created political crisis. Ludendorff, who had effectively been Germany's military dictator, suffered a nervous breakdown. He demanded that the government seek an armistice immediately, then reversed himself and called for continued resistance. His erratic behavior destroyed what little confidence remained in the military leadership. On September 29th, Ludendorff told the Kaiser that Germany must seek an immediate armistice. This confession of defeat shocked the civilian government. The war that had been portrayed as winnable just months earlier was now admitted to be lost. The government was ordered to seek peace based on Wilson's 14 points. But seeking peace proved complicated. Wilson insisted on Germany becoming a democracy before he would negotiate. The Kaiser was forced to appoint a new government headed by the liberal Prince Max of Baden, which introduced democratic reforms. But these reforms, made under pressure of military defeat, had no legitimacy. They were seen as imposed by the victors. The German High Seas Fleet, which had spent most of the war in harbor avoiding battle with the British, was ordered to sail out for a final suicidal attack on the British fleet. The admirals preferred to die heroically rather than surrender the fleet intact, but the sailors refused. They mutinied at the end of October, refusing to sail. The mutiny spread from the naval base at Kiel to other cities. Soldiers and workers formed councils, Soviets, echoing the Russian Revolution. By early November, revolution was sweeping across Germany. Bavaria declared itself an independent socialist republic. In Berlin, massive demonstrations demanded the Kaiser's abdication and an end to the war. The army was dissolving. Soldiers were deserting and going home. The government had lost control. On November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The social democratic politician Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed Germany a republic from a balcony of the Reichstag. Karl Liebknecht, a radical socialist, proclaimed a socialist republic from the imperial palace. Germany was now a republic, but which kind of republic, liberal democratic or socialist revolutionary, remained to be determined. That question would lead to more violence and ultimately contribute to the rise of Hitler. But on November 9th, the immediate question was ending the war. The new Republican government sent representatives to negotiate an armistice with the Allies. The negotiations took place in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne in northern France. Marshal Ferdinand-Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, presented the German delegation with armistice terms that were essentially an unconditional surrender. The terms were harsh. Germany must evacuate all occupied territory immediately, including Alsace-Lorraine. German forces must withdraw from the west bank of the Rhine River, and the Allies would occupy bridgeheads on the east bank. Germany must surrender vast quantities of military equipment, including 5,000 artillery pieces, 25,000 machine guns, 1,700 aircraft, and 5,000 locomotives. The treaties of Brest-Litovsk and Bucharest, imposed on Russia and Romania, must be renounced. Most humiliatingly, Germany must surrender its battle fleet. The naval blockade would continue, meaning Germany would still face starvation even after the fighting stopped. The German delegation protested that the terms were too harsh, but they had no leverage. The Allies were advancing on all fronts. Germany was in revolution. There was no choice but to accept. At 5 o'clock in the morning on November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. It would take effect at 11 o'clock that same morning, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. When the news spread that the armistice had been signed, the reaction was explosive. In London, Paris, and New York, massive celebrations erupted. People flooded into the streets, singing, dancing, embracing strangers. Church bells rang, sirens wailed, soldiers and civilians alike wept with relief and joy. The war was over. They had survived. In the trenches, the reaction was more muted. Many soldiers were too exhausted or emotionally numb to celebrate. Some felt profound relief. Others felt anticlimax or even disappointment that they would not get the chance to march into Germany and finish the job. A few units continued fighting right up until 11 o'clock, and men died in the final hours and minutes, killed in a war that was already over. At 11 o'clock, the guns fell silent. After 4 years, 3 months, and 1 week, the fighting stopped. The Great War, the war to end all wars, was finally over. But ending the fighting was not the same as making peace. The armistice was only a ceasefire. The real work of creating a peace settlement lay ahead, and it would prove almost as contentious and difficult as the war itself. Wilson's 14 points promised a just peace, but the European allies, particularly France, wanted to punish Germany and ensure it could never threaten them again. They had made secret treaties during the war, promising territorial gains that contradicted Wilson's principle of self-determination. The peoples of the collapsed empires were demanding independence and creating new nations, but the great powers wanted to control the process. The war had toppled 4 empires: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman, creating a power vacuum that needed to be filled. How this would be done, what kind of world would emerge from the ruins of the old order, remained uncertain. The human cost of the war was almost impossible to comprehend. Over 9 million soldiers had died. The exact number will never be known, but estimates suggest France lost 1.4 million, the British Empire nearly 1 million, Germany over 2 million, Russia over 2 million, Austria-Hungary over 1 million, Italy over 600,000, the Ottoman Empire over 300,000, and the United States over 100,000. These were just the military dead. Civilian casualties were also enormous, perhaps 10 million or more, from military action, disease, and starvation. The Spanish influenza pandemic that swept the world in 1918 and 1919 killed more people than the war itself, with estimates ranging from 50 million to 100 million dead worldwide. The war and the pandemic together killed over 60 million people in just a few years, perhaps 3% of the world's population. Entire generations of young men were decimated. In France, 1 in 5 men of military age died. In Britain, the officer class suffered disproportionately, creating a lost generation of leaders. Villagers across Europe erected war memorials listing the names of the dead, and in some small villages, nearly every family lost someone. The wounded numbered over 20 million, many permanently disabled, blinded, or disfigured. Shell shock, gas poisoning, amputations, the physical and psychological scars of war marked millions. The social and economic costs were staggering. Infrastructure was destroyed. Farmland was devastated. The economies of Europe were shattered. The financial cost of the war exceeded $200 billion in contemporary terms, equivalent to trillions today. The world that had seemed so confident and prosperous in 1914 lay in ruins. The question was what would be built from those ruins, and whether the lessons of the catastrophe would be learned or ignored. On January 18, 1919, representatives from 32 nations gathered at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris to negotiate the peace settlement that would officially end the Great War. It was exactly 48 years to the day after the German Empire had been proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, following Prussia's victory over France in 1871. The symbolism was not accidental. The conference lasted 6 months and produced a series of treaties that redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East, created new nations, destroyed old empires, and established a new international order. The decisions made at Paris would shape the 20th century, often in ways the participants neither intended nor anticipated. The conference is remembered primarily for the Treaty of Versailles with Germany, but it also produced separate treaties with Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. Together, these treaties attempted to address an overwhelming array of problems: territorial disputes, reparations, war guilt, disarmament, minority rights, colonial claims, and the creation of a new international organization to prevent future wars. The conference was dominated by the Big Four: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Each brought different priorities and perspectives. Wilson was an idealist who believed the war presented an opportunity to create a new international order based on democracy, self-determination, and collective security through a League of Nations. He saw himself as representing not just American interests but universal principles. Lloyd George faced pressure from British public opinion, which demanded that Germany pay for the war and that its capacity to threaten Britain be permanently eliminated. But he also worried that punishing Germany too harshly would create instability and possibly Bolshevism. Clemenceau, known as the Tiger, had lived through 2 German invasions of France and was determined that it would never happen again. He wanted Germany permanently weakened, stripped of territory, disarmed, and forced to pay reparations that would cripple its economy for generations. Orlando wanted the territorial gains Italy had been promised in secret treaties, particularly the port of Fiume on the Adriatic. The negotiations were complicated by the fact that the defeated powers were not invited to participate. This was a victor's peace, not a negotiated settlement. The Germans were presented with a treaty and told to sign it or face resumption of the war. They were given a few opportunities to submit written objections, which were mostly ignored. This meant that Germans could claim, and many did, that the treaty was a diktat, an imposed settlement that Germany had no choice but to accept. It was not a negotiated peace that Germany had agreed to, but an ultimatum forced on a prostrate nation. This perception, whether fair or not, would have profound consequences for Germany's political development and for European stability. The other defeated powers were treated similarly. The treaties with Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire were imposed, not negotiated. The treaty's territorial provisions redrew the map of Europe. Germany lost all its overseas colonies, which were distributed among the victors as League of Nations mandates, a euphemism for colonial rule. Alsace-Lorraine, taken by Germany from France in 1871, was returned to France. The Saar region, with its valuable coal mines, was placed under League of Nations administration, with France controlling the mines for 15 years, after which a plebiscite would determine its future. The Rhineland, the region west of the Rhine River, would be demilitarized and occupied by Allied forces for 15 years. Germany lost territory to Belgium and to the newly restored Poland. The Polish Corridor, a strip of land giving Poland access to the Baltic Sea, separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The city of Danzig, predominantly German, became a free city under League administration. These territorial losses meant Germany lost 13% of its European territory and 10% of its population. Austria-Hungary, the empire that had started the war by attacking Serbia, ceased to exist. The Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria and the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary formally dissolved the empire and created or recognized several new nations. Austria was reduced to a small German-speaking rump state, forbidden from uniting with Germany. Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory and population. Czechoslovakia was created from Czech and Slovak territories. Yugoslavia was formed from Serbia, Montenegro, and the South Slav regions of the former empire. Poland was reconstituted from territories of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. Romania gained Transylvania, Italy gained Trentino and Trieste. The multi-ethnic empire that had existed for centuries was broken up into nation-states, supposedly along ethnic lines. But the ethnic map of Central and Eastern Europe was far too complex for neat divisions. Every new nation contained significant ethnic minorities. Czechs ruled over Germans and Hungarians, Poles ruled over Ukrainians and Germans. Romanians ruled over Hungarians. Yugoslavia brought together Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes who spoke similar languages but had different religions, cultures, and historical experiences. The principle of national self-determination was applied selectively and imperfectly, creating as many problems as it solved. The most controversial aspect of the Treaty of Versailles was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It stated that Germany and its allies accepted responsibility for causing all the loss and damage suffered by the Allied governments and their nationals as a consequence of the war. This clause provided the legal justification for reparations. Germany would have to pay for the damage caused by the war. But the clause was far more than a legal technicality. It assigned moral responsibility for the war to Germany. Germans across the political spectrum rejected this. They believed that all the great powers bore responsibility for the war's outbreak, that the alliance system and imperialism and militarism were to blame, not Germany alone. The War Guilt Clause became a source of intense resentment and a rallying point for German nationalism. Politicians who accepted the clause were denounced as traitors. The clause poisoned German politics for a generation. The reparations themselves were even more contentious. The treaty did not specify a final amount, leaving it to a reparations commission to determine later. This created uncertainty and made the burden seem potentially unlimited. When the commission finally set the figure in 1921 at 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to $33 billion or roughly 400 billion in today's money, Germans were outraged. The amount seemed designed not just to compensate the Allies but to keep Germany impoverished indefinitely. Economists, including John Maynard Keynes, who had been part of the British delegation, argued that the reparations were economically unsustainable and would lead to German economic collapse, which would destabilize all of Europe. Keynes resigned in protest and published a scathing critique titled The Economic Consequences of the Peace, arguing that the treaty was a Carthaginian peace that would lead to disaster. His predictions would prove prophetic. The treaty also imposed severe military restrictions on Germany. The German army was limited to 100,000 men, enough for internal security but not for waging war. Conscription was forbidden. Germany could have no tanks, no heavy artillery, no military aircraft, no submarines. The General Staff, the elite institution that had planned Germany's wars, was abolished. The navy was limited to small vessels. These restrictions were intended to make Germany incapable of threatening its neighbors, but they were also humiliating. A nation that had prided itself on military prowess was reduced to a token force, and the restrictions were one-sided. The Allies did not disarm. The treaty spoke of German disarmament as a prelude to general disarmament, but the general disarmament never happened. This created a sense of injustice. Germany was being held to different standards than everyone else. The treaty's centerpiece for Wilson was the creation of the League of Nations, an international organization that would provide collective security and peaceful resolution of disputes. The League Covenant was incorporated into the treaty, making it the first 26 articles. Wilson believed the League would correct any injustices in the treaty and prevent future wars through arbitration and collective action against aggressors. But the League was fatally weakened from the start. The United States Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, meaning America never joined the League. This was a devastating blow. Without American participation, the League lacked the power to enforce its decisions. Moreover, the League excluded defeated powers and initially excluded Soviet Russia. It was a victors' club rather than a truly universal organization. The League would have some successes in the 1920s resolving minor disputes, but it would fail catastrophically in the 1930s when faced with determined aggression from Japan, Italy, and Germany. The treaty with the Ottoman Empire, the Treaty of Sevres signed in August 1920, was even more punitive than Versailles. The Ottoman Empire was stripped of all its non-Turkish territories. The Arab provinces were divided between Britain and France as League mandates. Despite promises made during the war to Arab leaders about independence, Palestine was placed under British mandate with the commitment to establish a Jewish national home, creating conflicts that continue today. Greece was given large portions of Western Anatolia. Armenia was to become independent. The Turkish Straits would be internationalized. Turkey was reduced to a fraction of its former size and placed under partial foreign control. But unlike Germany, Turkish nationalists led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk refused to accept these terms. They fought a war of independence, defeating Greek forces and forcing the Allies to negotiate a new treaty. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 gave Turkey much better terms, establishing it as an independent nation-state controlling Anatolia and a small part of Europe. Turkey was the only defeated power to successfully overturn its peace treaty through force. The reaction to the Treaty of Versailles varied. In France, many felt it was too lenient. Clemenceau was criticized for not dismembering Germany and creating a buffer state in the Rhineland. Marshal Foch famously said the treaty was not a peace but a 20-year truce, predicting that Germany would recover and fight again. In Britain, the opinion was divided. Some celebrated what they saw as a just peace. Others worried it was too harsh and would create resentment. In Germany, the reaction was overwhelmingly negative. The treaty was seen as a monstrous injustice, a betrayal of Wilson's 14 points, which Germany had agreed to as the basis for peace. Germans spoke of the Versailles Diktat and the stab-in-the-back legend, the claim that Germany had not been defeated militarily but had been betrayed by socialists and Jews on the home front. This mythology, though false, would be exploited by Hitler and the Nazis. On June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, German representatives signed the Treaty of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors. They signed under protest, making clear they considered the treaty unjust. The date and location were deliberately chosen for their symbolic significance. In the same hall where Bismarck had proclaimed the German Empire after defeating France, Germany now accepted a humiliating peace after being defeated by France and its allies. The symbolism of revenge was unmistakable. But this symbolism, satisfying as it might have been to France, stored up trouble for the future. The treaty created a Germany that was neither conciliated nor crushed, a Germany that was resentful but potentially powerful, a Germany that might seek to overturn the settlement by force when the opportunity arose. The peace settlement, meant to end all wars, contained within it the seeds of the next World War. The Great War destroyed more than empires and killed more than soldiers. It shattered the culture, values, and assumptions of European civilization. The optimism and confidence of the pre-war world gave way to disillusionment and cynicism. The belief in progress, the faith in reason and science, the conviction that Western civilization represented the pinnacle of human achievement, all these were destroyed in the trenches. A generation of writers, artists, and intellectuals who experienced the war either as soldiers or witnesses emerged, determined to express the horror they had seen and to question everything their societies had taught them. They became known as the Lost Generation, a term coined by Gertrude Stein and popularized by Ernest Hemingway. They were lost because the world they had known was gone, and because they could not fit into the society that emerged after the war. Their work would define modernism and shape cultural discourse for decades. The war literature that emerged in the 1920s and 30s was unlike anything written about previous wars. There was no glory, no honor, no celebration of heroism. Instead, there was mud, rats, corpses, terror, and the grinding meaninglessness of industrialized slaughter. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, published in 1929, became the definitive anti-war novel. It told the story of a group of German schoolboys who volunteer enthusiastically for the war and are systematically destroyed by it, physically and psychologically. The narrator, Paul Boomer, survives almost to the end of the war, watching all his friends die, before being killed himself on a quiet day shortly before the armistice. The novel's final line, noting that Paul died on a day when the military report stated that all was quiet on the Western Front, captured the terrible irony of individual death in a war where millions died. The book sold millions of copies worldwide and was banned by the Nazis, who correctly saw it as undermining militarism. British war poets like Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Isaac Rosenberg captured the horror in verse. Owen's poems, most published posthumously after he was killed a week before the armistice, exposed the lie that it was sweet and fitting to die for one's country. His poem, Dulce et decorum est, described a soldier dying from gas, drowning in green light, and asked readers if they knew the reality of war. Would they still tell children the old lie that death in battle was glorious? Sassoon, who survived the war but was nearly court-martialed for publishing a protest against the war's continuation, wrote bitter poems denouncing the generals who sent men to die and the civilians who celebrated war from safe distance. Robert Graves's memoir Goodbye to All That detailed his experiences on the Western Front with a mixture of black humor and horror. These works influenced generations of readers and established the template for how the war would be remembered in English-speaking countries. French writers also grappled with the war's meaning. Henry Barbouse's Under Fire, published in 1916 while the war still raged, described the reality of trench warfare with shocking realism. It won the Prix Goncourt but was controversial for its unflinching depiction of soldiers' suffering. Roland Dorgel's Wooden Crosses memorialized the ordinary French soldiers who endured unimaginable conditions with stoic courage. In Germany, Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel offered a different perspective, portraying war as a transcendent experience that revealed human capacity for courage and endurance. Unlike the anti-war writers, Junger found meaning in combat, though he did not romanticize the horror. His work influenced German nationalist thought and was admired by both the left and right for its unflinching realism and refusal to censor. The visual arts were equally transformed by the war. Painters who served as soldiers or official war artists created works that captured the war's surreal horror. Paul Nash's paintings of devastated landscapes, dead trees against poisoned skies, suggested an apocalyptic vision. Otto Dix's etchings depicting wounded soldiers and corpses were so disturbing that some galleries refused to display them. The German Expressionist movement reflected the war's psychological impact with distorted figures and violent colors, suggesting a world gone mad. The Dada movement, born in neutral Switzerland during the war, rejected all traditional values and embraced absurdism and nihilism as responses to a civilization that could produce such carnage. If reason and progress led to mechanized slaughter, Dadaists argued, then reason and progress must be rejected. Their provocations and anti-art gestures influenced the development of surrealism and other avant-garde movements. The war accelerated social changes that had been underway before 1914 but which now occurred with revolutionary speed. Women had filled jobs vacated by men who went to war, working in factories, driving ambulances, serving as nurses, taking on roles previously reserved for men. When the war ended, there was no going back to the old gender roles. Women in most Western countries gained the right to vote in the years immediately after the war, partly as recognition of their contributions. Fashion changed dramatically. The restrictive corsets and long skirts of the pre-war era gave way to shorter skirts, bobbed hair, and more comfortable clothing. The flapper of the 1920s, with her short hair, short skirts, and rejection of Victorian morality, symbolized the new freedom. Social conventions regarding marriage, sexuality, and behavior relaxed. The Victorian era was definitively over, swept away by the war's disruptions. Class structures also changed. The aristocracy, which had dominated European society for centuries, lost much of its power and prestige. Aristocratic officers had led men over the top to their deaths, and aristocratic incompetence had become associated with the war's futility. The Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian aristocracies were destroyed, along with their empires. The British and French aristocracies survived but diminished. The war had shown that noble birth did not guarantee competence or wisdom. Many aristocratic families lost heirs in the war, ending ancient bloodlines. Great estates were sold off to pay death duties. Servants became hard to find as people found better opportunities in the expanding industrial economy. The democratic age that Wilson had promised was arriving, though not in the way anyone had anticipated. The war also transformed attitudes toward authority and tradition. Young people who had been sent to die based on lies told by their elders became deeply skeptical of authority. The generation gap that had always existed became a chasm. The young felt that the old had betrayed them, had sent them to die for nothing, and had learned nothing from the experience. This generational conflict manifested in cultural rebellion. Jazz music, brought to Europe by African American soldiers, became popular despite efforts by cultural conservatives to suppress it. The music was seen as primitive and sexually suggestive, which was precisely why young people embraced it. Dancing styles became more energetic and less formal. Nightclubs and cabarets flourished. In Germany, the Weimar Republic became associated with cultural experimentation and decadence, with Berlin rivaling Paris as a center of avant-garde culture. The Spanish influenza pandemic that swept the world in 1918 and 1919, killing tens of millions, added to the sense of civilizational crisis. The virus killed primarily young, healthy adults, the same demographic that had been slaughtered in the war. Communities already traumatized by war losses now faced a deadly pandemic. Public health systems were overwhelmed. Cities imposed quarantines and closed public spaces. People wore masks and avoided crowds. The pandemic's origins are uncertain, but it spread rapidly through military camps and was carried worldwide by troop movements. The name Spanish flu is misleading. Spain was not the origin but was neutral in the war and had uncensored press that reported on the pandemic while warring nations suppressed news to avoid undermining morale. The combination of war and pandemic created apocalyptic fears. Some wondered if civilization itself might collapse. The economic impact of the war was catastrophic and long-lasting. European economies were shattered. Germany and Austria faced hyperinflation in the early 1920s that wiped out the savings of the middle class. In Germany in 1923, a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. People carried money in wheelbarrows. Life savings became worthless overnight. The hyperinflation was eventually controlled, but the damage to social stability and faith in institutions was permanent. The middle class felt betrayed and impoverished, creating conditions for political radicalism. Britain and France faced massive war debts, much of it owed to the United States. They hoped to repay these debts with German reparations, creating a circular system that depended on German prosperity, which the reparations themselves undermined. The global economy became increasingly unstable. The United States emerged from the war as the world's leading economic power, having lent billions to the Allies and having expanded its industrial capacity enormously. But America rejected the international role Wilson had envisioned. The Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles or join the League of Nations. America retreated into isolationism, restricting immigration, raising tariffs and focusing on domestic prosperity. The 1920s became the Roaring Twenties in America, a period of economic boom, cultural innovation, and social change. But American isolationism left Europe to solve its own problems without American engagement and American economic policies. Particularly high tariffs and insistence on debt repayment contributed to European economic difficulties. When the American stock market crashed in 1929, triggering the Great Depression, the global economic system collapsed, with devastating consequences for political stability worldwide. The war's psychological impact extended far beyond veterans suffering from shell shock. Entire societies were traumatized. The scale of death meant that almost every family had lost someone, War memorials erected in every town and village listed names that included brothers, fathers, sons, cousins, friends. Communities marked Armistice Day, November 11th, with 2 minutes of silence to honor the dead. But this collective mourning could not fully process the grief and loss. Some people, particularly in France and Britain, became committed pacifists, determined that there must never be another war. Others, particularly in Germany and Italy, drew different lessons, believing that their nations had been robbed of victory and must rearm and seek revenge. The war created both the League of Nations and fascism, both international cooperation and aggressive nationalism, both pacifism and militarism. Its legacy was contradictory and unstable, setting the stage for even greater catastrophe 2 decades later. The peace settlement that emerged from the Paris Peace Conference was supposed to create a stable international order that would prevent future wars. Instead, it created the conditions for an even more catastrophic conflict just 2 decades later. The Treaty of Versailles and its companion treaties contained fatal flaws that made another war not inevitable but certainly more likely. Germany was humiliated but not permanently weakened. The new nations created in Central and Eastern Europe were fragile and often contained ethnic minorities that looked to neighboring states for protection. The League of Nations lacked the power to enforce its decisions. The United States retreated into isolationism. The Soviet Union was excluded from the international system and pursued its own revolutionary agenda. And the economic instability created by the war and the peace settlement would culminate in the Great Depression, which destroyed democracies and empowered extremists across Europe. In Germany, the Weimar Republic that emerged after the Kaiser's abdication began life under terrible disadvantages. It was associated with the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, which German politicians had been forced to sign. Right-wing nationalists blamed the Republic for accepting the treaty and propagated the stab in the back legend, claiming that Germany had not really lost the war but had been betrayed by socialists and Jews on the home front. This was a lie. The German army had been decisively defeated in 1918, and the High Command had demanded the government seek an armistice. But the lie was politically useful. It allowed nationalists to claim that Germany could have won if not for internal enemies, and it blamed democracy and its supporters for the defeat and the treaty. The Weimar Republic never escaped this original sin of being associated with national humiliation. The Republic faced immediate challenges from both the extreme left and right. In January 1919, communists led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg attempted to seize power in Berlin in what became known as the Spartacist Uprising. The government, lacking reliable military forces, turned to the Freikorps paramilitary units composed of demobilized soldiers and nationalist volunteers. The Freikorps crushed the uprising with great brutality, murdering Liebknecht and Luxemburg. Over the next few years, the Freikorps would suppress communist uprisings in Munich and elsewhere. But they also participated in right-wing coup attempts, including the Kapp Putsch in 1920. The Republic was under siege from extremists who rejected democracy entirely. The center could not hold when the extremes were armed and violent. The hyperinflation of 1923 was particularly devastating. When Germany defaulted on reparations payments, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr industrial region to seize coal and manufactured goods directly. The German government called for passive resistance, which meant paying striking workers while receiving no revenue from the occupied region. The government printed money to cover its expenses, and the currency collapsed. By November 1923, one United States dollar was worth 4 trillion marks. Life savings were wiped out. People who had worked and saved their entire lives found themselves impoverished overnight. The psychological impact on the German middle class was profound. They had believed in hard work, thrift, and playing by the rules. Now they felt betrayed by their own government and by the international system that had imposed this misery on them. This resentment would be exploited by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. He served as a soldier during World War I, where he was wounded and recognized for his bravery. After the war, he became involved in a small political group in Munich, which he later transformed into the National Socialist German Workers' Party. He gained attention as a speaker, connecting with people frustrated by the aftermath of the war and the challenges facing Germany. In November 1923, during the chaos of the hyperinflation, Hitler attempted to seize power in Munich in the Beer Hall Putsch. The coup failed and Hitler was imprisoned. During his imprisonment, he wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his ideology of racial supremacy, territorial expansion, and revenge against France. Most observers dismissed Hitler as a failed fanatic. They were catastrophically wrong. Italy, though on the winning side, felt cheated by the peace settlement. Italy had entered the war expecting territorial gains but received less than promised. The port of Fuma, which Italy demanded, was not granted. Italian nationalists spoke of a mutilated victory and blamed the democratic government for weakness. Economic problems, strikes, and political instability created a sense of crisis. Into this situation came Benito Mussolini, a former socialist who had supported the war and now organized ex-soldiers into fascist squads that attacked socialists and communists. Mussolini's fascist party combined nationalism, anti-communism, and promises to restore Italy's greatness. In October 1922, Mussolini's black shirts marched on Rome, and King Victor Emmanuel III, fearing civil war, invited Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini gradually dismantled Italian democracy, establishing a one-party dictatorship. Fascist Italy would serve as a model for other authoritarian movements and eventually allied with Nazi Germany. In the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks consolidated their power through civil war from 1918 to 1921. The Red Army, organized by Leon Trotsky, defeated various white armies that fought to restore the monarchy or establish different governments. Foreign powers including Britain, France, Japan, and the United States intervened militarily to support the whites, sending troops to Russian ports. This intervention failed to overthrow the Bolsheviks but created lasting Soviet paranoia about capitalist encirclement. The Civil War was brutal, with atrocities committed by all sides, and it devastated an economy already ruined by the World War. Millions died from combat, disease, and famine. By the time the Bolsheviks secured control, Russia was exhausted. Lenin implemented the new economic policy, a partial return to market mechanisms, to revive the economy. But when Lenin died in 1924, a power struggle ensued that Joseph Stalin eventually won. Stalin would transform the Soviet Union into a totalitarian state and an industrial power through forced collectivization and industrialization that killed millions. The new nations created in Central and Eastern Europe faced enormous challenges. Poland, reconstituted after over a century of partition, fought a war with Soviet Russia in 1919 and 20, successfully defending its independence. But Poland's borders included large German, Ukrainian, and Jewish minorities who did not identify as Polish. Czechoslovakia, created from Czech and Slovak territories of Austro-Hungary, was a relatively successful democracy in the interwar period, but it included 3 million ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland who increasingly identified with Nazi Germany. Yugoslavia brought together Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes who had very different historical experiences and visions for the state, creating tensions that would explode in violence decades later. Hungary, reduced to a fraction of its former size with a third of ethnic Hungarians now living in neighboring states, became bitterly revisionist, seeking to overturn the Treaty of Trianon. These ethnic tensions and revisionist ambitions would be exploited by Nazi Germany in the 1930s. The Middle East also inherited instability from the War and Peace settlement. The Arab Revolt, encouraged by Britain during the war with promises of independence, helped defeat the Ottoman Empire. But Britain and France divided the Arab provinces between themselves as League mandates, betraying the promises made to Arab leaders. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret treaty between Britain and France, carved up the region with little regard for ethnic or religious boundaries. The borders drawn by colonial officials created states like Iraq that combined different sectarian and ethnic groups with no history of common political identity. The Balfour Declaration, in which Britain promised to support the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, created conflicts between Jewish immigrants and the Arab population. These tensions would lead to violence in the interwar period and ultimately to the Arab-Israeli conflict that continues today. The arbitrary borders and unfulfilled promises of World War I created problems that the Middle East still struggles with a century later. The League of Nations, Wilson's great hope for preventing future wars, proved ineffective. The League's covenant required members to respect the territorial integrity and independence of all member states and to impose economic and military sanctions on aggressors. But the League had no army of its own and depended on members to enforce its decisions. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League condemned the aggression but did nothing to stop it. Japan simply withdrew from the League. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League imposed some economic sanctions but not on oil, without which Italy's military could not function. Britain and France, the League's leading members, were unwilling to risk war with Italy. Ethiopia was conquered. The League's failure to stop aggression encouraged further aggression. Hitler learned that the Western democracies would not act decisively to enforce international law. The Great Depression, which began with the American stock market crash in October 1929, destroyed the fragile economic recovery of the 1920s. Unemployment soared, international trade collapsed, banks failed. The gold standard, which had been partially restored in the 1920s, broke down as countries abandoned it to protect their economies. Germany was particularly hard hit because its recovery had depended on American loans. When those loans were recalled, the German economy collapsed. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed. Democratic governments seemed unable to cope with the crisis. Extremist parties on both the left and right gained support by promising radical solutions. In Germany, the Nazi Party's vote share increased from less than 3% in 1928 to 37% in July 1932, making it the largest party in the Reichstag. In January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany through a combination of electoral success and political maneuvering by conservative elites who thought they could control him. They were wrong. Hitler quickly consolidated power, destroying German democracy and establishing a totalitarian dictatorship. He withdrew Germany from the League of Nations, began rearmament in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and pursued an aggressive foreign policy aimed at overturning the post-war settlement. In 1936, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, sending German troops into territory that was supposed to be demilitarized under the Versailles Treaty. France and Britain protested but did nothing. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria, uniting Germany and Austria in violation of the peace treaties. Britain and France accepted this. Later that year, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, rather than risk war. Britain and France pressured Czechoslovakia to cede the territory. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich claiming to have achieved peace for our time, but there would be no peace. In March 1939, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, making clear that his ambitions were not limited to uniting ethnic Germans but extended to conquering other peoples. When Hitler demanded territory from Poland and threatened invasion, Britain and France finally drew a line, guaranteeing Polish independence. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun just 20 years after World War I ended. The peace settlement that was supposed to make the world safe for democracy had failed. The League of Nations that was supposed to prevent aggression had failed. The war to end all wars had ended nothing. Instead, it had set the stage for an even more destructive conflict. The death toll of World War I was approximately 20 million. World War II would kill over 60 million. The Great War's legacy was not peace but a generation of growing tensions and instability that culminated in an even greater catastrophe. World War I ended over a century ago, but its shadow still falls across our world today. The political borders it created, the ideologies it unleashed, the technologies it accelerated, the social changes it catalyzed, all continue to shape the 21st century. To understand the modern world, you must understand the Great War and its aftermath. The war destroyed 4 empires in the old aristocratic order that had dominated Europe for centuries. It accelerated the rise of mass democracy, though it also created the conditions for totalitarianism. It redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East in ways that created conflicts lasting generations. It demonstrated the horrifying potential of industrial technology applied to warfare. And perhaps most fundamentally, it shattered the optimistic belief in inevitable progress that had characterized the pre-war era, replacing it with a darker, more skeptical worldview that still defines modern consciousness. The political map of Europe and the Middle East today is still fundamentally the map created in 1919. The nation-states that emerged from the collapsed empires: Poland, Czechoslovakia, which later divided into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, the Baltic states, Yugoslavia, which violently fragmented in the 1990s, all owed their existence to the peace settlement. The arbitrary borders drawn in the Middle East by British and French officials, borders that divided tribes and sects, created states like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan that have struggled with internal divisions and conflicts ever since. The promise of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, made by Britain without consulting the Arab population, led to the establishment of Israel and the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Kurdish people, promised independence but denied it, remain divided among Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, still seeking their own state. The consequences of decisions made by exhausted diplomats in Paris a century ago continue to produce violence and instability today. The war fundamentally changed the nature of warfare itself. World War I was the first truly industrial war, the first total war in which entire economies and societies were mobilized. It demonstrated that modern war was no longer fought just by professional armies on distant battlefields but involved entire populations. The distinction between military and civilian targets became blurred. Strategic bombing, submarine warfare against merchant shipping, economic blockades that starved civilians, all became acceptable tactics. The technologies developed or perfected during the war, tanks, aircraft, submarines, chemical weapons, radio communications, would shape military thinking and subsequent conflicts. The lessons learned about combined arms operations, the integration of infantry, artillery, armor, and air power, became the foundation of modern military doctrine. The German blitzkrieg tactics of World War II were refinements of the infiltration tactics developed in 1918. Modern mechanized warfare was born in the mud of Flanders and the forests of the Argonne. The war also changed how societies organized themselves during conflicts. The massive state intervention in the economy that occurred during World War I, government control of production, rationing of consumer goods, management of labor, set precedents for state power in emergencies. The propaganda techniques developed to maintain civilian morale and demonize the enemy were refined in subsequent conflicts and continue in modern information warfare. The concept of total war, in which entire populations are legitimate targets and all resources are devoted to victory, reached its logical conclusion in World War II and influenced Cold War planning for nuclear conflict. The idea that civilians are combatants simply by supporting their government economically or politically, an idea that would have been rejected before 1914, became accepted. The erosion of limits on warfare that began in World War I has never been fully reversed. The war's impact on political ideologies was profound and lasting. 3 ideologies that would dominate the 20th century emerged from the war's crucible. Soviet communism, established in Russia during the war, promised a workers' paradise but delivered totalitarian dictatorship and mass murder. Fascism, arising in Italy after the war and spreading to Germany and elsewhere, combined extreme nationalism, rejection of democracy, glorification of violence, and racism into a toxic ideology that led to World War II and the Holocaust. And liberal democracy, which had seemed triumphant in 1918, proved fragile in the face of economic depression and political extremism. The interwar period became a struggle between these competing visions of how society should be organized. Democracy survived and eventually prevailed, but only after enduring catastrophic challenges. The war demonstrated that democracy was not inevitable or self-sustaining but required constant defense against authoritarianism. The Treaty of Versailles and its association with German grievances became a cautionary tale that influenced how the Allies approached peace after World War II. The lesson drawn from Versailles was that punitive peace settlements create resentment and instability. After 1945, the Western Allies chose not to impose reparations on Germany but instead to rebuild it. Through the Marshall Plan, West Germany was integrated into Western institutions rather than isolated. Japan received similar treatment. This more generous approach contributed to the successful democratization of former enemies and the creation of stable, prosperous states. But the lesson of Versailles has sometimes been over-applied. The belief that any peace settlement involving territorial changes or accountability for aggression will create another Versailles has made the international community reluctant to enforce consequences for aggression or to recognize the legitimacy of changing borders even when populations clearly support it. The war's cultural legacy is equally profound. The literature, art, and films about World War I shaped how subsequent generations understood war. The image of soldiers in trenches enduring artillery bombardment while futile attacks were ordered by incompetent generals became the defining metaphor not just for World War I but for senseless sacrifice generally. Terms from the war entered common language. Going over the top means facing danger. No man's land describes any dangerous or contested space. Shell shock gave way to combat fatigue and then post-traumatic stress disorder. But the concept that war traumatizes participants psychologically, not recognized before World War I, is now understood as inevitable. The iconography of poppies growing on battlefields, of the unknown soldier, of 2 minutes of silence, all originated with World War I commemoration and continue today. The war also accelerated social changes, particularly regarding gender roles and class structure. Women who had worked in factories and served in auxiliary military roles during the war gained political rights. With most Western countries granting female suffrage in the war's immediate aftermath, the rigid class hierarchies of the pre-war era never fully recovered. The aristocracy lost its monopoly on political and military leadership. Meritocracy and social mobility increased. The Russian Revolution abolished aristocratic privilege entirely. Even in countries where aristocracies survived, their power and prestige diminished. The 20th century's dominant ideology of democratic equality received a major boost from the war's leveling effects. Soldiers who had fought together regardless of class background demanded greater equality when they returned home. The war that had been started by emperors and aristocrats ended with their world destroyed. The war's demographic impact created long-lasting effects. The massive death toll, concentrated among young men, created generation gaps and gender imbalances. In France, 1.5 million widows and hundreds of thousands of orphans needed state support. Many women who would have married found no potential husbands because an entire cohort of men had been killed. Birth rates already declining before the war fell further, with consequences for population and economic growth that lasted decades. The war also displaced millions. Russian refugees fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution, Greeks fleeing Turkey, Armenians surviving genocide, Germans expelled from former territories, created massive refugee flows that strained receiving countries and created new communities in diaspora. The passport, which before the war was unusual, became standard as states tried to control population movement. The war created the modern system of border controls and national identification that we take for granted. The Armenian genocide, perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire during the war, was the 20th century's first genocide and a forerunner of the Holocaust. Between 1 and 1.5 million Armenians were killed through massacres, forced marches into the desert, and deliberate starvation. The genocide occurred in the context of war and the empire's collapse. With authorities claiming that Armenians were disloyal and posed a security threat, the international community's failure to punish those responsible or to ensure Armenian survival as a nation emboldened later perpetrators. Hitler, planning the Holocaust, reportedly asked who today remembers the Armenians, suggesting that genocide could be committed with impunity. Turkey's continued denial of the genocide remains a source of international tension and demonstrates how the war's unresolved injustices continue to poison relations. The League of Nations failed to prevent World War II, but it established precedents for international cooperation that influenced the United Nations created after 1945. The concept of collective security, that aggression against one nation should be treated as aggression against all, though poorly implemented by the League, became central to the UN Charter. The League's work on health, labor standards, and refugee protection continued through UN specialized agencies. The International Labour Organization, created by the Treaty of Versailles, still exists today. the idea that international institutions should set standards for human rights and economic relations, though often honored in the breach, remains fundamental to the international order. World War I and the failed peace that followed taught that international problems require international solutions, even if implementing those solutions remains difficult. The economic consequences of the war extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. The global economic system centered on London, and the gold standard never fully recovered. American economic dominance, beginning during the war when the United States became the world's leading creditor nation, shaped the 20th century. The Great Depression demonstrated the interconnectedness of national economies and the danger of protectionism and competitive devaluations. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system attempted to create stable international monetary arrangements and institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to prevent economic catastrophe. These institutions traced their origins to lessons learned from World War I's economic aftermath. The importance of international economic cooperation to prevent conflict became a fundamental assumption of post-1945 order. The war's scientific and technological legacy extended far beyond military applications. Aviation advanced from fragile wood and cloth contraptions to metal aircraft capable of carrying significant payloads. The war proved aviation's military potential and stimulated investment that led to commercial aviation in the interwar period. Radio, used for military communications, became a commercial medium that transformed entertainment and news. Medical advances in treating trauma, pioneering plastic surgery for disfigured soldiers, developing rehabilitation for amputees, came from wartime necessity. Blood transfusion techniques were perfected. The war's demand for chemical production accelerated the chemical industry's development. Synthetic materials, fertilizers, medicines, all benefited from wartime research. The war demonstrated that governments could mobilize scientific resources for national purposes, a lesson applied in World War II's Manhattan Project and in Cold War science funding. Perhaps the war's most important legacy is psychological and philosophical. The Great War destroyed the Victorian era's optimism and faith in progress. The belief that Western civilization represented humanity's apex, that science and reason would inevitably improve human life, that history moved toward greater enlightenment, all was shattered in the trenches. The war exposed the dark side of modernity. The same scientific and industrial progress that had created prosperity also created gas attacks and machine gun slaughter. Rationality and efficiency were applied to killing on an unprecedented scale. Civilization's thin veneer was revealed when supposedly civilized nations descended into barbarism. This loss of innocence, this recognition that progress was not inevitable and that civilization could destroy itself, defines modern consciousness. We live in the shadow of World War I's revelation that humanity is capable of mechanized self-destruction. The Great War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It accomplished the opposite, creating conditions for an even more destructive conflict and demonstrating that modern war could threaten civilization itself. The empires that collapsed, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman, were never rebuilt. Their dissolution created nation-states that struggled with ethnic tensions, authoritarian temptations, and economic instability. The idealistic hope that democracy would spread and that international law would govern relations between nations was disappointed by the rise of totalitarianism and the failure of collective security. The soldiers who fought expected their sacrifice to create a better world. Instead, their children fought an even worse war. The generation that suffered through World War I left us a legacy of trauma, lost illusions, and hard-won wisdom about war's horror. Whether we have truly learned the lessons they paid for with their blood remains an open question. The long shadow of the Great War still falls across our world, reminding us that the catastrophes of the past can return if we forget their lessons. World War I changed everything because it destroyed the old world and revealed the terrible potential of the new one. We are still living with the consequences.